First puzzle, the threats are: queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Rook takes pawn, check. Checks in this position are: queen to c8, check. Queen to e8, check. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Solution to the puzzle is: queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes queen. Rook takes queen, check. Let's continue. Threats in puzzle position are: queen takes rook. Queen takes knight. Knight takes knight. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen to c7, check. Queen to d6, check. Queen to c3, check. Knight to e2, check. Answer to this puzzle is: queen to c3, check. King to h4. Knight to f3, check. King to h5. Knight to f4, check. King to h6. Knight to e6. Next puzzle, threats in this position are: rook takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are: rook takes pawn, check. h2, check. Answer to this puzzle is: queen takes pawn. f3. Queen to e3, check. Rook to f2. Rook takes pawn, check. King to h1. Rook to h2, check. Rook takes rook. Queen takes pawn, check. King to g1. Queen takes rook, check. Let us go to the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn, check. Checks in puzzle position are: knight to d6, check. Knight takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using d6. Knight to b6. Pawn takes pawn. Knight to c8. Knight takes pawn. c3. Knight to d7. King to e7. Knight takes pawn. c2. Knight to d3. King to d6. King takes pawn. Another puzzle. Threats in puzzle position are: pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Checks in puzzle position are: g5, check. The best move in puzzle position is: pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. g5, check. King to g6. King to g4. Another puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position: king takes pawn. Queen takes knight, check. The checks are: queen to g2, check. Queen to h1, check. Queen takes knight, check. The best move in puzzle position is: knight to g5. Queen to h5. Queen to d5. Rook to e7, check. King to f8. One more. Threats in puzzle position are: queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Bishop takes bishop. Bishop takes pawn. Pawn takes knight. Checks in this position are: queen to g7, check. Queen takes rook, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The answer is: knight to g4. f5. Bishop takes bishop. Queen takes bishop. Bishop takes bishop. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are: rook takes pawn, check. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes pawn. Checks in this position are: rook takes pawn, check. The puzzle is solved using rook to d6. Bishop takes pawn, check. Queen takes bishop. Let us go to the next puzzle. Here are threats in puzzle position: knight takes bishop. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is d5. Pawn takes pawn, check. King to b6. Let us go to the next puzzle. The threats are: rook takes knight. Queen takes pawn. Queen takes knight, check. The checks are: queen takes knight, check. Knight to f2, check. Knight to b2, check. Answer to this puzzle is: queen takes knight, check. King to c2. Queen to e4. Rook to b1. Knight to e1, check. King to b2. Rook to b8, check. Let's continue. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are: knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes knight. Queen takes pawn, check. Bishop takes pawn. Rook takes knight. The checks are: Queen takes pawn, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Queen to e2. Rook to c8. Knight takes queen. One more. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The best move in puzzle position is g6, h4, f5. Pawn takes pawn. Pawn takes pawn. Next puzzle, here are the threats. Rook takes knight. Queen takes knight. The checks are rook to h8, check. The answer is queen takes knight. Rook to d7. King takes pawn. Bishop takes knight. g7. Rook takes pawn. Rook to h8, check. King to f7. Rook takes rook, check. Another one, here are the threats. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Knight takes pawn. Queen takes knight. The checks are rook takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn, check. Queen to g6, check. Queen to g7, check. Queen to g8, check. The answer is c3. Queen to a5. Rook to f5. Bishop to g6. Rook takes knight. Rook takes rook. Queen takes rook. Another puzzle. The threats are queen takes pawn, check. Knight takes bishop. Knight takes knight, check. Knight takes pawn. Here are the checks. Bishop to c5, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to e3, check. Queen to b6, check. Knight takes knight, check. The answer is knight takes knight, check. Rook takes knight. Bishop to c5, check. King to f1. Knight takes pawn, check. Let's see the next puzzle. The threats are. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The puzzle is solved using king to e5, h5, h3. Let's continue. Threats in this position are. There are no threats in this position. There are no checks in this position. The answer is king to g2. Knight takes pawn, check. King to f1. Rook takes rook, check. Queen takes rook. f4. Pawn takes knight. Another one. Here are the threats. Bishop takes knight. Knight takes knight. Knight takes pawn. Knight takes bishop. The checks are knight to f3, check. Knight to e2, check. The best move in puzzle position is knight takes bishop. Pawn takes knight. Knight takes knight. Bishop takes bishop. Queen takes bishop. Next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. Queen takes knight. Bishop takes pawn. Bishop takes pawn. Knight takes bishop. Pawn takes pawn. There are no checks in this position. Solution to the puzzle is pawn takes pawn. King takes pawn. Queen to h4. Next, puzzle position vulnerabilities are. Rook takes rook. Rook takes pawn. Queen takes bishop, check. The checks are. Rook to b8, check. Queen takes bishop, check. The best move in puzzle position is. Rook takes rook. King takes rook. Rook to b7, check. King to e8. King to h2. d4. Queen takes bishop. Bishop takes rook. Queen takes bishop. Let us go to the next puzzle. Puzzle position vulnerabilities are. There are no threats in this position. Checks in this position are. c4, check. Answer to this puzzle is h4. King to e4. King to b6. King to f5. King to b5. King to g6. a5. Another puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. Checks in puzzle position are. Rook to d1, check. Rook to c1, check. Solution to the puzzle is. Rook to d2. King to e1. Rook to b2. King to d1. Rook to c2. One more. The threats are. There are no threats in this position. The checks are. Rook to g6, check. Rook to a2, check. Here is the solution to the puzzle. King to f4. King to f2. Rook to a2, check. King to e1. King to g5. King to d1. King takes pawn. Let's continue. Here are threats in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen takes pawn, check. Rook takes pawn. Let us look at checks in puzzle position. Queen takes pawn, check. Queen to h7, check. Queen takes pawn, check. The answer is f6. Queen to a7. Bishop to e6. Bishop to d2. Rook takes pawn. Let's see the next puzzle. Let us look at threats in puzzle position. There are no threats in this position. The checks are knight to d4, check. The answer is knight to d4, check. Knight takes knight. King takes knight. King to f4. a5. a3. b5. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.